Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Garrett and Zaritza and University of Maryland, the National Center for Smart Growth, UCD, and the Lincoln Institute for bringing us all here. And I, too, look forward to the conversation and to learning with everyone today and tomorrow. How many people here are on Facebook? About a little bit more than half of the people. So what does the U.S. regulatory system of land use control and land use planning have to do with Facebook? Well, when you register to get on to Facebook, one of the things when you put in your personal information, for those of you that do this, you may remember that you can put in what is your relationship status. And Facebook gives you a lot of different options. For example, it says that you can tell people that you're single, or you're married, or you're engaged, or you're in a relationship, you're a widow, you're separated, and so forth. There are about a dozen different options. But the one that caught my attention, and the one that I think is related to what we're going to talk about today, is your relationship status on Facebook could also be, it's complicated. And so I think that this sums it up pretty well. There are many different types of relationships in the United States when it comes to land use control and planning frameworks. No one may always be perfect, and we have a long history, which hopefully will come out as part of the short presentation today, our history and politics that explain the how and why that our system is simply complicated. So let me start with a quick overview of federalism, or the relationship between different levels of government in the United States. So we have one federal government, and from the federal government we are organized under the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution talks about the relationship between the federal government and our state governments. So we have 50 state governments. The federal Constitution does not talk about the relationship between the federal government and local governments, because local governments are creatures of our state governments. So among our 50 state governments, we have roughly, depending upon how you want to count them, about 30,000 units of local government. Those 30,000 units of local government might include things like counties, towns, cities, villages, township, boroughs. We call them different things in different states, but they are sub-unit regions of government that have different authority when it comes to planning and zoning, and they're not all the same. It depends upon what state you're in and what authority the state government has given to those units of local government. And so before I even get down below, you can automatically see that the federal government really doesn't have any direct control over the local governments, because it's the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. The fact remains, however, in the United States that land use planning and land use control rests with about the 30,000 units of local government, with some exception, and those are the states that you're going to hear about over this 2-day period. But in most of the states, including my own in New York, where we have 1,600 units of local government, and more than 1,500 of them have the authority to engage in planning and zoning, not the state of New York and not the federal government, you can see why things get complicated. Then let's layer into that regional planning, or regional agencies in the United States. And these, again, come from different levels of government and are created in different ways. So we have some federally created regional agencies, and these are in different states in different parts of the country, and again, primarily created to deal with preserving an important natural resource. So, for example, the Columbia River Gorge Commission was first created by an act of Congress, and then the interested counties and the states got together under this federal law to do some regional planning, contrasted with the Tahoe Regional Planning Authority that came about because 2 states, California and Nevada, decided that they needed to get together to protect the resource of Lake Tahoe, and then a year later Congress enacted a federal statute to deal with the planning in that area, again to endorse what the 2 states had done. So there was a federal role, but here's just two different examples of one that was driven by the states and then the federal government responded, and one where the federal government acted first and then the states and the planning counties that were involved then took over. A lot of regional planning agencies are created by state government. So for example, in my own state, the Adirondack Park Agency was created in 1971 to protect the roughly 6 million acres of land in the Adirondack Park. And it sets up a framework of kind of regional planning, but in cooperation with local planning. And again, another very complicated scheme where there has been a lot written. To then in 1991, New York State creating something called the Hudson River Valley Greenways Planning Council, which is a concept of compact planning to bring together the counties on both sides of the Hudson River in order to cooperate with planning, but the state set the planning framework. Then we have a lot of intermunicipal cooperative agreements that promote planning across municipal lines that are voluntary all across the United States, and they could also be viewed as a form of regional planning. So in just this one slide, it shows the complexity of what the system is like in the United States. So the question then becomes, what is the most appropriate level of government to control land use in the United States? And the question is also internationally, in your own countries, what is the most appropriate level if you have sub-levels of government? So, what's the role of the national government? Is it to set out a national framework? When you have a large landmass and you have 50 states and you have 30,000 units of local government, how detailed and how specific can you be? What exactly is the role of the federal government between policies and guidance versus actual control, actual regulation? In the 1970s, as the paper discusses, there was a failed attempt to set forth a National Land Use Planning Act, a National Land Use Policy Act is what it was called by Senator Jackson. It was really intended to supplement and enhance coordination of government action at the state level. It was not to set forth a federal comprehensive land use plan and a federal zoning statute, but really to get the federal government more engaged and involved with the state governments. That did not pass. So what we have now are varying models of state control. What's happened is that all of the states were given authority to put forth planning and zoning enabling acts to let their local governments go forward. Again, with small exception that I'll talk about and that you'll get more detail about over the next 2 days. Regionalism, should we do this by regional planning? And again, what is a region? We can't even agree on what's a region in the United States. I'm not sure if you can agree on or have agreed on what's a region in other countries. Primarily, a region is how a group of people want to define a region. It's typically either one or more units of government that have authority and control over a certain area that agree to get together. It can be over a geographic natural resource. It can be just because they're in a certain area and decide that they want to plan together. But there's no one size, there's no one size fits all in terms of what regional planning has to look like. And so we come back to the case for local control, which is primarily the system that we have. So it is disparate, it is oftentimes uncoordinated, fragmented. On the other hand, as we'll see as we get through, maybe this is what works best within a system, within guidance, within framework, within some kind of collaborative model where there's leadership and guidance maybe coming from higher levels of government. But again, with local control, you have government closest to the people. And I'll talk more about that as we go on. So the development of land use control in the United States is a lot younger than land use control in other countries. The first zoning ordinance was adopted by the city of New York in 1916. And I have to step back and say, why was zoning enacted in the United States? The paper goes through the history of zoning in New York City and basically tells us that this was an economic move, and it was really a discriminatory move, because think about Fifth Avenue in New York City, all the high-end shops. the Fifth Avenue Merchants Association back in the early 1900s didn't like the fact that the factory workers who were working in the sweatshops were pouring out into the streets around Fifth Avenue, causing congestion in the streets, and they believed that it was preventing customers from coming to their stores. And so they wanted to keep certain kinds of people out of Fifth Avenue. And they went to the city of New York and got the city to adopt the first zoning ordinance. So yes, we can talk about all the public health, safety, and welfare benefits that might have come with it. We could talk about the height of buildings, and we can talk about density, and we can talk about prevention of fire and spreading and so forth. But really at the heart of it, it was for discriminatory purposes. In 1926, our United States Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of zoning in the famous case of Euclid versus Ambler. But again, if you go back and read that decision, it's no wonder why certain interest groups sent a telegram to the U.S. Supreme Court afterwards requesting a copy of the decision, because the court talked a lot about what we call now Euclidean zoning in the United States, which is separating what are perceived to be incompatible land uses, which again may be the antithesis of smart growth and sustainable planning, which we now talk about today. But our history has been separate uses, don't put uses, different kinds of uses, don't put them together, don't integrate them. And so we were separating people of different socioeconomic status and so forth, and that comes through in the decision. However, if the Supreme Court had not upheld the constitutionality of zoning in 1926, we might not be having a seat at the table with you all today. So again, it was very important. Another interesting facet of the role of the federal government. In 1924, the United States Department of Commerce, when Secretary Herbert Hoover was in charge, put together a committee and first published a draft Model Zoning Enabling Act. The final one was published in 1926, and then in 1928 they published a Model Planning Enabling Act. And interesting, they were model acts from the federal government, but they were instructive and guidance to the state governments, for the state governments to adopt statutes to enable local governments to do the planning and the zoning. But just one interesting factoid, the Zoning Act came out first before the Planning Act. And most of us in this room come from a planning perspective and think that the planning ought to come before the zoning, before the land use regulation. And so again, what the mindset was early on in the United States. So how do we get to figure out, again, another way of looking at land use control, land use planning in the United States? Pre-1920s, as I just described, this was really all a local government kind of action. In the 1930s to the 1960s, we had a number of federal programs that started to influence local land use controls. Some of them are mentioned in the paper, but we had agencies that were coming up with infrastructure planning. We had the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development looking at housing policies. We had infrastructure programs putting people to work, transportation programs. That was all starting to influence how our communities were developing. Then in the 1970s, EPA's Commission on Environmental Quality commissioned a report that came back titled The Quiet Revolution in Land Use Reform. And this report started to explain how states were now beginning to exert control over land use planning, and they predicted the delocalization of land use control. The authors of the report really bashed local control. They talked about it as a, quote, feudal system where municipalities decide land use issues for their own egocentric benefit, and that it was self-protecting. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon the perspective that you have, I don't think that the Quiet Revolution really manifested itself in the way that the authors had hoped that it would into the future. We've had a lot of federal government attempts to, people want to call it control. I really call it influence local land use planning. Although the National Land Use Policy Act didn't pass around the same time the National Environmental Policy Act did pass. Well, yes, it's a federal law and it deals with federal action. except it spurred about 16 states to adopt what are called mini NEPAs, mini National Environmental Policy Acts, that basically say when you have a significant land use decision, you have to go through an environmental review. So another federal influence. And I put up the picture of our former, now deceased Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, because every time I think about land use control, I think about something in this book, and he said all politics is local. And that's what I think it comes down to in the United States. So what you're going to hear about over the next 2 days, so I'm not going to take my time going into detail. There's a great book that the Lincoln Institute published by a former colleague, again recently deceased. We lost a giant in the growth management field, John DeGrove, Planning Policy and Politics, and he talks about the different waves of land use control in the United States. And in the 70s, we started with comprehensive state planning. Some of those states are represented at this conference. Then in the 1980s, we didn't talk about comprehensive state planning. The buzzwords were growth management. And then in the 1990s, we stopped talking about growth management. Now we got into the framework of smart growth. And we actually got more governors in the United States, more states interested in smart growth in the 1990s. Many more executive orders, many more task forces were formed, and there was a tremendous amount of state statutory reform in the United States in the 1990s, in part, I think, informed by the American Planning Association's Growing Smart legislative guidebook that a number of people in this room were involved with. And the fourth wave I've added in, I think that takes us to current time. We still talk about smart growth, but really the dialogue has moved to sustainability because of climate change. But yet, all of these things, they mean the same thing. They have a little difference in them. Most of the difference is semantics, but it's what's selling in the public because you need to have the political leadership in order to realize the change. So when should the federal government exert land use control? And that's the big question, and a good part of my paper in the second half is focused on this. Should we be looking at the environment? So for example, we've got that National Environmental Policy Act. We have federal laws that regulate mining. We have federal laws that set forth a framework for planning in the coastal zone. We have federal laws that deal with clean water, with endangered species, with disaster mitigation. And sometimes these do impact state, regional, and local planning. Is that a good thing that the federal government sets out this framework, or would we rather have it at the state level or purely local? What happens when it comes to energy? So we have a Energy Policy Act from 2005. I think the biggest issue within the Federal Energy Policy Act that impacts local planning and zoning is that the federal government can now preempt local land use control when it comes to the siting of transmission lines. Although the law says that, it's a whole other political nightmare because we have preemption and we have control and different levels of government fighting over that. But what about climate change? Again, we don't have a federal government policy in the United States really on climate change. We don't have targets and goals. So the real action is taking place at the state and local governments. And so for those that are looking at the federal government for the answers, again, I think sometimes when there is leadership and you can get a broad policy statement, it's good. But me personally, I'd rather see the control at the state and really more at the sub-state, at the local level, for the reason that you can act quicker and get change and get to the goals that the people at the grassroots really want, because the politics is different. But what happens when it comes to areas of civil rights, like fair housing and making sure that we don't have discrimination in housing, or accessible buildings like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or a newer federal law that ensures anti-discrimination based on religion, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Communications infrastructure, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 basically says local governments can't keep out cell towers because people thought that the cell towers were ugly or that they caused health concerns. And so we said we need a national communications infrastructure policy. In 1996, I think a lot of people at the local level were very disdainful of the federal act, then I think after 9/11 happened, people were maybe grateful that we had a national communications infrastructure. Does it depend on land ownership? The federal government owns about 650 million acres of land throughout the United States. So should their control be just on their land? However, their land, military bases, for example, national parks, they're also adjacent to land, they're in states and they're in communities. And how do we plan together? How do we coordinate that? And some federal agencies do a better job than others when it comes to that. So how has the federal government generally influenced local land use control? Well, with the carrot and the stick, right? So they offer money as incentives, and there's also the hammer sometimes, and that's when it comes to preemption. Some of our newer programs from 2009, the Partnership for Sustainable Communities has put together programs from our Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation and Environmental Protection Agency to go out and incentivize communities to plan cooperatively, to plan sustainably, and to do things different. The Tiger grants also were enacted in 2009, and these were grants to improve our nation's infrastructure, and they could necessitate local governments to change their zoning in order to qualify for some of that funding. And so I conclude with, I wish I had a crystal ball on the future of federal land use control in the United States. I think it depends on the issue and the politics and the money and the power that derives from that issue. So one issue we're currently dealing with right now is hydrofracking, getting out the natural gas from the shale, from the rock, throughout different parts of the United States. Well, some of this rock formation is on federal land. So the federal government has expressed policies on their land, but they have not expressed policies with respect to this energy issue nationwide that would apply to all the states and local governments. Some states, like Vermont, has said no hydrofracking in Vermont. In New York, our governor has said we want to get to hydrofracking, but we still don't have a state policy, but yet we have local governments all over the country that have said, some say yes, because it's economic development and it's energy, and others say no, because we think it's going to hurt the environment in the long run. So another state of confusion on a significant land use issue now. I think that we're going to continue in a piecemeal approach in the United States. I don't think it's so bad, but I do think that we need constant leadership. We need the federal government to be involved, the state government to be involved. It really is all about partnerships and collaboration and working together in setting out policies, in having coordination, but the question is, who really makes the decision at the end of the day? Thank you.